Hello everyone, today we talk about Jurchen warfare. You know that we have this series looking at in and around Chinese warfare. We talked about the Mongols, Northeast Asian peoples, to the important degree their conquering waves, of course, affect not just China, but important parts of Eurasia at large. If you consider especially the domino effect, like some peoples would remain, like in this case, Northeast Asia, but they would have in that sense, effects on the movement of peoples pretty far away from that in Western Eurasia. Read the Liao-Khitan that, by the way, I already made a video about concerning their warfare. We will naturally at some point go much more in depth in this topic. This is a series I started, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. And I think it's pretty useful because it covers like the entirety of these various dynasties, peoples, empires across Asia in a very schematic fashion, and realizing sort of the basic implications and relations among all these various peoples. So identifying the precise geographical and cultural placement of the Jurchen people is interesting, right? This exists as well today, and they are distinct from the Mongols, narrowly meant. At least, that there is an important degree of, hybrid, depending on what kind of peoples you look at. This is especially even more evident in warfare. We will see this better later. They were also different from the Khitans and the Hsiung-nu, right? We haven't talked about the latter yet, made lots of videos about Mongol warfare, but we will expand also on previous times. The Jurchen inhabited the region immediately east of the Hsiung-nu territories, that is to say, an area corresponding to present-day northern Manchuria, characterized environmentally by dense forests and rugged terrain. It would in fact shape the Jurchen's semi-nomadic lifestyle and martial styles. The Jurchen's art of war was deeply influenced by such contexts relying on mobility and adaptability. For a long time, they remained essentially a fringe people, and as such, they were fundamentally versed in guerrilla tactics, leveraging especially deforested landscapes for ambushes and rapid strikes, a strategy that later proved devastating even against more structured armies like the Khitans, right? So the landscape is interesting also because it shows you that they weren't just in the plain open steppe, and this would characterize on that frontier that, as we understand here, was very much influenced by China as well. Some sort of more compact type of warfare, as a matter of fact. The reliance on guerrilla naturally depends on the relative rapport with another power, that if stronger, of course, is simply going to be enough to deter any sort of open field confrontation and reduce these guys to, in fact, to the bushes, to the fringe. But of course, they had their own military, and even though we do not know too much about it, as we will understand now, there's a moment in which they rose to power, also further south, west, overwhelming, in fact, more advanced militaries due to the almost habitudinary political upheavals in that northern frontier, to be essentially also very similar to them military-wise. Historically, the Jurchen posed little threat to neighboring powers, most of the time, engaging only in occasional small-scale border skirmishes over the centuries, until the 12th century AD, when, as we'll see, they will rise to regional power. So the aforementioned wars, often over resources or territory, honed the Jurchen combat skills, but up to that later point did not elevate them to more than provincial prominence. Of course, in the fringe, you have this tentative strategy of seizing sort of the fresher pastures, the more fertile land, and the stronger powers are going to be worn out in the struggle, but essentially succeed in keeping you out. The landslide occurs when the Khitan Liao Empire, again, I made a video about these guys. They're a bit like the predecessors of the Mongols from a military standpoint. There was even an important military in Mongol warfare altogether. In fact, the Liao, having consolidated power through a sophisticated military system combining nomadic cavalry with Chinese-style administration, and also more typically sort of sedentary forces, naturally always controlled by the cavalry, was at the center, but we observed what kind of military complexity existed in their armies. In fact, also, because of that military instrument, harbored imperial ambitions that led to an invasion at some point of the same Jurchen lands in the northeast around 1114 AD. This is important because it shows how the Jurchen were worth an imperial, at least an ambitiously imperial attention, right, to be tamed and overcome. This aggression, however, provoked an unprecedented Jurchen counterattack, the ferocity of which stunned the Khitans. Obviously, times were ready for the Jurchen's rise, as it was proven by the success in the aforementioned campaign, known in fact as the Jurchen Rebellion, right? There is a massive counterattack, right? A rise of the Jurchen, rooted in their ability to exploit, at that point, Liao overextension and internal descent, which is the best combination to exploit, really. You beat the enemy in detail in a pretty big theater, right? Far from his bases of operation with stretched supply lines. So you exploit basically the best of your forces that gain steam and mass along the way. At that point, being able to actually pass to the counterattack because of the essential paralysis followed to this unforeseen disaster, that of course makes a great deal of leverage on an important fragmentation. Also, the Liao system that was never centralized power per se, and was very, again, Mongol in style. Needless to say, the Jurchen fight more or less on the same footing. For example, they employed cavalry charges, coordinated assaults to primarily disrupt the Khitan supply lines. So it's mostly like a steppe kind of warfare, right? And that's the nomadic bias, very up to wear out, especially like bulkier forces that try to advance on desolated territories. The reasons for the Jurchen's decisive victory remain debated among historians. We can't fully see what would really happen. For example, we do not know whether they fielded an exceptionally large army or capitalized on a severely weakened Liao military system. Armies historically have some sort of peak moments, ups and downs. It's not like the Liaos were, again, a forever power that simply had pretty solid bases to just dominate the entire surroundings. They had been great in the beginning, but they could fall as much as they had risen. As we'll see, this is also true for the Jurchen. That surely would have undermined the enemy fort, exploiting its corruption. Also, the fact that likely towards the later phases of the war, the Liaos began to rely on conscripted troops that were not just qualitatively weaker, right, and essentially mirroring the collapse of the more important equestrian backbone of this Mongolian forces, but that would also, in fact, spread resentment among the population, the subjects at this point, so like a crumbling power. and facilitated the operation. Also in favor, in fact, of the Jurchen, that would have been seen as a change. These people would have owed, in fact, to the local populace and establishment in part the same takeover, right? We know, however, strategically and operationally this much, that the Jurchen warriors launched a devastating offensive into the Khitan-held territories, so swarming in the heart of their power, culminating in the collapse of the same Liao dynasty as soon as 1125. In parallel, there is an obvious military hybrid forming. In fact, the Jurchen's military prowess during this period was marked by their adoption of Khitan tactics. Likely, the core of the bulkier Jurchen forces would have operated in similar ways already before these clashes, but it seems that the use of heavy cavalry and feigned retreats was importantly enhanced, right? This army passed to some sort of, again, more guerrilla style, more scattered force with a decentralized command structure, still capable of exploiting, in fact, these qualities during the war. However, to a coming back, that in fact witnesses the general strategic principle that when your strong forces are put together, and again, like there is not a people that simplifies just with guerrilla, and when has the advantage does not concentrate forces to pass to a counteroffensive, also at a broader strategic and regional level, right? So there is probably no mystery regarding this. There's no doubt that Khitan warfare was a school for these neighbors, as it would be for the Kingizids, etc. In fact, the same Jurchen, later Jin, would have a role in that, as they were eventually taken over by the Mongols. The Qara-Khitan, that I also made a video about, because they are essentially this remnant of the Liao that we understand as a different people, fled westward to establish, in fact, this new state in Central Asia, actually in the from Central to essentially Western Asia, up to the frontier with Khorasan, as a matter of fact. So we're talking pretty far west, bringing those Mongol influences up to those places way before Genghis Khan, and even having, in fact, ambitions to mostly come back to the north of China to recover at some point what had been lost in this struggle. Very interestingly. Nothing incredibly solid, as you understand, but still provided with a very strong sense of revanchism and this very higher sense of, again, of imperial grandeur that the Khitan had matured in the previous generations. Conversely, the Jurchen that had displaced this people founded in their stead the Jin dynasty. This dynasty, however, was the one, in fact, later absorbed in the north of China by Genghis Khan and his Mongols in 1234. Right, so it lasts barely more than a century, which is a big deal for those time standards, like multiple generations of, in fact, further growth to an extent, and also exchange with his neighbors on the frontiers. The end of the Jin/Jurchen followed a series of campaigns that is essentially exposed their inability to counter Mongol siege warfare, for example, that had already been acquired through the contact with the Khitan and the same Jin. But especially at that point, their immense sort of moral force that can be attributed, of course, to Temujin has a broader metaphysical meaning, and we don't question, but say the mobility of steppes warfare was mastered by Genghis Khan to a degree that, especially when coupled with siege warfare, that initially the same Genghis Khan sort of had to lick his own wounds for the failures in, was somehow irresistible. Could say it in this way. These were naturally also hardly and closely fought wars, but it's important to point out that the Jurchen were among the first to taste, in that sense, the Kingizid fury. Regarding the Jurchen military organization, information on their military system is limited with few primary sources, providing detailed insights. The most authoritative work to date is an article by Jing-shen Tao, which offers a concise overview of their organizational framework. Jing-shen Tao is a Taiwanese-American professor emeritus of Chinese history at University of Arizona and correspondence research fellow at Academia Sinica, who specializes in medieval Chinese and also Inner Asian history, particularly the Song, Liao, and Jin dynasties, which offers a concise overview of their organizational framework. All right. The Jurchen military hierarchy included the rank of or title of Po-chi-lieh, which surpassed the Meng-an, a commander in turn responsible for 1,000 soldiers. All right, it was essentially a regiment of sort, and we can imagine this higher commander to be some kind of line commander, some kind of greater sort of battle commander. Though the exact scope of these officers' authority remains unspecified by the texts. Then we know the Mou-k'e leading a smaller unit, ranging from 100 to 300 soldiers, so basically the equivalent of a company. Always remember that these numbers are not given by sources like, I don't know, the actual size of a garrison somewhere out of an archive dog. It's just like mostly narrative sort of chronicles that tell about a broader picture, right? And we know that more or less the company has this size, but it would have not necessarily been, for example, 300, or at least the troops would have often been understrained. As you understand, there is always a pattern, like it's all across human history. Military units tend to follow that kind of organic size. So that, obviously enough, the Jurchen had a pretty conventionally organized force that would just come to know through the specific terms coming from their dialect that allowed for flexible deployments in battle and more. This structure was in turn, as we said before, but not entirely, influenced by Khitan models, right? Emphasizing loyalty to tribal leaders, because at the end of the day, that's what these troops were. They were essentially Mongols, right? Or something similar. And rapid mobilization, right? Enabling the Jurchen to respond swiftly to threats. So a typical sort of warrior culture of the semi-steppes that fights more or less with the same broader strategic and tactical dynamics that we have seen across all the Eurasian steppes. The Jurchen art of war was thus better defined by a blend of nomadic and sedentary military traditions. However, as we were hinting at before, the Jurchen art of war, like the Khitan, was characterized by a blend of nomadic as well as sedentary military traditions, because these peoples had come to occupy essentially that frontier area in northern China that was also populated, it was urbanized. As we were saying before, the same Genghis Khan had to recur to impressive siege capabilities to take out the Jin themselves. The Jurchen warriors were adept at both open field battles and sieges, a versatility that in this sense set them apart from purely nomadic groups like, in fact, the early Mongols. As we've seen in the video about the Khitan, there was a higher degree of infantry compared to the steppes. It's true that these steppes, again, weren't purely just nomadic desolation. There were semi-sedentary populations, even among, in fact, the semi-nomadic peoples. In fact, how much is nomadic and much is sedentary, it varies across the steppes. There were isles of also particularly advanced peoples in the middle of nowhere. Eventually, for example, were overrun by the Mongols, but that we archaeologically can trace. What we mean here, however, is that the Khitans, the Jurchen, had been absorbing properly like more Chinese styles of warfare, and the same militias of the communities that they had come to rule upon. And both dynasties actually did rule over pretty large swathes of China. Doesn't matter how predatorily or decentralized fashion, they adopted themselves Chinese style of warfare. Heavy infantry was important in support to cavalry. It made some hypotheses concerning the wing role that especially certain halberdiers may have had when supporting especially heavy cavalry in open field. Surviving artwork that I partly used here depicts Jurchen warriors especially clad in heavy armor, right? Likely made of iron scales or lamellar. Made videos about probably lamellar armor. We'll come back on the topic at some point too, which provides this protection against arrows, melee weapons to an important degree that is typical, especially of those parts of the world in design that can be also quite old in time, survived just up to very few, actually the last century in design, practical use. This, of course, is a flattering depiction of the warrior elite that would have been just the minority of troops. There is some, as I was saying before, imperial and therefore relatively exploitative character of this establishment. Nor the Khitan nor the Jin ever became fully Sinicized, right? They were always like a steppe barbarian force that was just rising to some level of dominance on Qin, right? So everything laying under Evan, but just basically a part of the northern part. To them, this meant a lot. It means that they could also extract lots of resources from much richer places that may have contributed to the stiffening of some sort of heavy cavalry backbone in their forces. After all, it's not that different from the Mongol ones that we see, especially in the following centuries. Again, even as far as that is concerned, not much really changed. The fact that we're talking about hybrids is also evident from the aforementioned integration of more sophisticated combined arm tactics, including important levels of infantry. Unlike the later Mongols that were sort of much more projected towards still a more characteristically steppe kind of warfare, enhanced by, Chinese technology, etc., but not really being so commixtive, except for the Yuan, eventually how they became a Chinese empire, and made 3 videos about their armies. It's probable, however, that lightly armored cavalry units equipped for speed and reconnaissance were typically constituting at least the numerical backbone of the Jurchen/Jin armies. All right, this is really typical of the broader steppe warfare. We know that there is an elite of heavies that is elite also numerically, and then all these subject peoples that are fighting as horse archers simply because they don't have much else to go to war with. It's true that there is going to be something in between as well, and again, especially the exploitation of northern China could have brought to a favorable distribution of resources in a select body of troops, like the same one that had allowed the Khitans to rise to an imperial force. We can't speak of veritable military reforms. Mostly these people succeeded in knocking out the local governments and installing themselves, exploiting those resources. So what would have happened is that the various clans in which they were subdivided would have seized more resources in the local sort of sanitary magazines, warehouses, etc., and entrenched themselves in the fortified positions and increasing their material affluence that could have been distributed in some sort of dirigistic way among an elite or some sort of aristocratic element of the army. The substance, however, does seem to have remained the same. The Jurchen's use of composite bows, similar to those of the Khitans and Mongols, allowed them to engage enemies at range before closing with lances or sabers. This all happened basically in a synergic fashion, combined arms that is typical of all the peoples of the steppes. Were we to estimate the composition of the Jurchen army, we would have more historical problems because, again, we do not really have a clear idea of the numerical distribution. The heavily armored elite on even partially armored horses, possibly an equal number of cavalry. We're talking maybe just 1/10 of the army each. Then we would have really a large proportion of variedly armored cavalrymen on unarmored horses. When we talk about armored cavalrymen here, we can talk everything from actual heavily armored, like with lamellar cuirasses, etc., to sort of felt, tanned leather cuirasses of some sort, and even some simpler forces, maybe a minority of merely like basically naked, just with a cloth, cavalrymen on unarmored horses in the function of runners, messengers, also skirmishers, archers, etc. Right. So, as you understand, regardless of the hypothesis, that cavalry part is important because, as you know, certain breeds contributed heavily to logistics. Right, this was a thing in Central Asia in particular. Here we are more or less in the northeast of it, but there were certain camel breeds that were very reliable in especially some of the most terrifying, climates, right, with enormous temperature excursions and sort of the capacity of the camel in particular to endure a long time, not much without drinking because they need to drink, but without eating that much because of the fat story in their humps. This picture, as you understand, suggests a heavy reliance on cavalry, with armored units forming at least the backbone of the Jurchen army. Inclusion of cavalry was relatively unusual for that northeastern corner of Asia, but it may reflect further adaptations to diverse terrains encountered during campaigns, possibly borrowed, as we've seen, from Central Asian allies at the same time. The Khitan, after all, would be expelled, as we've seen, to the west, and so there would have been connections even with these further enemies, contacts across Central Asia. So it's not really strange at all, and it's possible that some of these camels would be imported to Northeast Asia. The high percentage of relatively heavy cavalry indicates a balance between protection and mobility, but also the need to engage heavier infantries than the ones would have been found in the steppes. All right. In any case, still crucial for the Jurchen were hit-and-run tactics in the sense during prolonged engagements. So the capacity of softening up, in fact, even not just heavy cavalrymen, but more solid infantry formations that was among the same Jurchens that would have even fought themselves among each other after also the Jin rule was established, would have not been that strange, as a matter of fact. As we've seen, following the Khitan-Liao Empire's dominance, the Jurchen emerged as a formidable power. The Liao's military system, which integrated nomadic cavalry with Chinese infantry and siege technology, had initially overwhelmed its rivals, including the Song dynasty to the south. We'll talk about the Song in a dedicated video. However, the Jurchen's campaign against the Liao from 1114 to 1125 exploited, as we've seen, the weaknesses in the system, particularly, or arguably, the Liao's over-reliance on static defenses, on what were perceived sort of more outer barbarians that didn't have capacities to storm. In fact, such fortresses, due to the polyurcetic knowledge acquired by these now semi-sedentarized Mongols. The southern Sung dynasty, located south of the Liao and engaged in its own struggles against the Khitans, supported the Jurchen during this campaign, providing logistical aid and diverting Liao resources. The Jurchen, having adopted Liao military strategies such as the use of cataphract-style cavalry in fortified camps, decisively crushed Liao power. From 1218 to 1232, the Koreans, under the Goryeo dynasty, in fact, that's what also the name of the country comes from, waged courageous but ultimately futile resistance against the Mongols, culminating in the Korean king's retreat to Kangba Island. The Mongol invasion of Korea, marked by battles such as the siege of Kujo in 1231, showcased their superiority in mobility, psychological warfare, which overwhelmed many Korean fortifications. We talk about Korea exactly because of their reliance on siege defenses. In fact, Korea was, in the sense, naturally sort of good to be defended from the north, bottling, like with the sea from both sides, like the advances along this territory dotted with fortification. So when you realize the chronological and geographical surroundings of the Jurchen power, the Jin dynasty, you realize that all around their military culture existed like a fairly developed military capacity, as far as, again, more sedentarized forces, both like from probably the deployment of infantry and sort of important strongholds, so the siege capacity to counter them, combined with more traditional steppes elements that in fact were also pretty much received by the Koreans, by the Chinese, even more far away, right? Even Japan is influenced by steppes warfare. I will make a video explaining this better, like you have specific let's say items, specific arms and armor styles that look something more like Central Asian than, I don't know, Chinese influence. This is especially true for Korea. And so when you look, because it's as if there had been an arc over China that spread, in fact, like steppes, military culture all around, up to reaching even Japan via sea. And so when you look at what is in between, it's exactly the homeland of the Jurchens in Manchuria. This is, again, greatly relevant because all these people, said, as you understand, overlapped, like in terms of spheres of influence, of dominions, and partly even in the ethnic fringes, superimposition, like they shared specific military styles and influences. As we said before, for example, I don't know, the Khitans were more famous by Mongol standards by heavy cavalry, cataphracts, so to say, and for siege capabilities. Well, again, even before their rise to power, the defeat of the Khitans themselves, surely the Jurchens would have had something like that, especially in their elites ruling from the more fortified emplacements. Just their lifestyle was, however, very wild. Imagine what could be Manchuria in the 12th century, right? Something almost undescribable. Besides, of course, we are talking now about the highlights of Jurchen military history, but say the history of the Jurchen people is much wider, so you understand that whatever was happening in the surroundings, it would have been fundamentally similar to that military culture. The Jurchen established the Jin dynasty in the former Liao territories, maintaining friendly relations and alliance with the Sung in the south that, as we've seen, had contributed to the overthrowing of the Liao. Had attempted, of course, to exercise some influence towards these southerners. The Jurchens were sort of less oppressive. Again, they had really been called to dislodge the Khitan, so there was surely some broader agreement and appeasement also besides these alliances to limit possible expansions, etc. We couldn't really quite control or foresee it even on the medium run. But all this contributed also to a further integration of the Jurchens in essentially a Chinese system and the updating of their military. However, the Jin's military organization, while effective against the Liao, struggled against the Mongols, whose innovative, say, combinations of siege tactics and steppes warfare, unified sort of especially command structure under Temujin, and proved superior to these people. Again, probably the Mongols didn't bring in any specific innovation. They fought really like even in more primitive ways than the Jurchen, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. They were loaded with a more cohesive political purpose, a greater moral force, and sort of religious vision. And as such, they basically outpowered an exhausted state that had never just like these still fringe Chinese, say Mongol Chinese empires had remained, right? This is not like the Yuan that will literally install themselves as a Chinese dynasty all over China, right? And or controlling properly most of it. So also the fact again that the Liao and the Jin had remained more or less in that fringe was sort of provisional, part of a provisional strategic balance that the Mongols came finally to shatter by overwhelming the entire system. However, in strictly technical terms, as we said, also deriving their military, their technical skills from this peoples like the Khitan, the Jurchens, against whom the Mongols had tasted defeat, especially for the lack of polyrcetic skills that are, however, adequately built up by the same Mongols in again, what had to be allegedly like a wasteland. It was evidently just about that. But it's not even about that technical aspect. It's not even about, I don't know, having siege machinery or some sort of broader technical insight on how to properly besiege a city, but just even a more organized, a more united force that could take on the challenge that was evidently understood, like in the strategic essentials, because again, it's not like the Mongols in fact had ever been isolated, but these other peoples had been a medium that had allowed them to develop something more. And still the Mongols in the steppes will remain essentially a nomadic people. It's rather when they settle in China, they are fundamentally something else, while retaining the sense that the main divisions are basically connected with that frontier and the Karakoram, and probably were the fuel, like the properly the supply, the major recruitment pool of, in fact, the Mongol sort of, let's call them divisions, to give an idea of what we are looking at, like these forces being able really to reach the extreme, the different sides of Eurasia were based on, right? The Qin dynasty fell to the Mongols, as we've seen, in 1234 after, by the way, a prolonged campaign. It's not like they simply crumbled as Temujin appeared. But there are key battles like the Siege of Kaifeng in 1232-33, exposing Qin's inability to adapt also to Mongol encirclement strategies, which evidently had not much to do but with a sort of a Chinese influence or whatever, but they were just part of the superior skills of the Mongol leadership in that specific time. And all the broader political, moral, and cultural reasons that were laying at the root of this umpteenth regime change that here was, however, to last for a greater amount of time. We described how this happened in a video about the Qingizid Yuan campaigns, battles, etc. I made a specific content explaining that the theater, the siege of Kaifeng in particular, campaigns and the various clashes, the last stands of the same Jurchen, etc. So it's interesting. The Khitan Liao dynasty's legacy endured despite its collapse as well. After their defeat by the Jurchen, a faction of Liao tribes fled westward, as we know, founding the Qara-Khitan state, also known as the Black Khitan, right, as the Turco-Mongol term for Qara being black, in central Western Asia. This state was centered essentially in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, so always ready to cross the mountain passes and getting from the Chinese side of the watershed to reclaim what was felt like a lost throne that could not but be recovered because of the imperial universal importance that was strongly perceived by Mongols coming to rule over these places. During, in fact, the Jin dynasty, Khitan military traditions remained, as we've seen, including the use of heavy cavalry, the Chinese-style bureaucracy. And the same is somehow true for the Qara-Khitan as well in the West. Naturally, those were a bit more locally reliant in more difficult ways in Central Asia, more distant from the Chinese world and also sort of the Mongol motherland. In any case, the same Qara-Khitan would be conquered by the Mongols in 1218. So even before the Jurchen fell. This is also interesting because it shows that there was a civilizational solidity, even more about, of course, a Chinese foothold than a Central Asian one. The Qara-Khitan's campaigns, such as their victory over the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Katvan in 1141, demonstrated also, however, in sort of West-Eastern comparison, their resilience and tactical sophistication. We'll talk more about that encounter between East and West because the Seljuks are mostly studied for the Crusades, but we forget how much this Mongol presence existed before the more classically intended Mongol conquests, as far as, in fact, Seljuk-dominated territories. This tells you also how Central Asian the Seljuk military culture and outlook, and in essence, really was, regardless of the heavy Persification of this Turkic people. By the late 12th century, the Mongol nation was thus fractured into three primary tribes, each marked by mutual hostility. The absence of unified leadership rendered them underestimated by their neighbors, with neither the Tangut in the west nor the Jurchen Jin in the east viewing them as a significant threat. The Tangut, ruling the Western Xia dynasty, relied on fortified cities and a mixed army of infantry and cavalry in the same way, but their isolationistic policies left them vulnerable to Mongol aggression themselves. So again, we'll talk about for example, the Xia that were delayed basically between the Songs and the Liao, but a bit more like in the West. As long as before the Jurchens came about as well. So you find also this political, not really incoherence, but you understand essentially what Genghis Khan came to eventually overrun, right? A system that had been significantly fragmented with imperial ambitions that, however, didn't land exactly where they should have in sort of in hindsight, so we can't so say. It's interesting to think how, because we're looking at, as you understand, these cultures in relatively quick order succession, so not really in the way we would have normally done had we looked at them a bit more in depth. I don't know whether we're going and how, at which point we're going to really plunge into this topics, like a bit in these polities, in a deeper way. Surely there is some chance to do so in the future. We're covering also the various Chinese powers. We talk about the tanks, for example. You arrive the songs, etc. We do it really for the first time. This is also an interesting part of it. Sometimes I don't know how much the series is followed, because this would be like, China, but also her allies and enemies more than else. So let me give a look at, because I created some playlists, and we talked, in fact, even more about the surrounding peoples than actual Chinese warfare, right? And in fact, for this reason, I realized we have a playlist of 8 videos, and as a playlist, not the single videos, made 200 views. It's a fairly recent playlist, if I'm not wrong, so it's again, certain things are more watched, certain others are less. Like, it's a bit difficult to understand what dynamics the stuff follows, but I'm sure that at some point, regardless of the fact that there are sort of more limited accounts about this warfare. This is particularly true today with the Jurchens. This is a relatively short video as a consequence. There is really an importantly large, let's say, analysis you can carry out about especially the relations between these powers, right? Because I understand that, especially if someone doesn't have a specific background in Chinese history and warfare throughout the centuries, but also like the difficulties picturing all the vicissitudes, the political changes, the dominations in Asia at large. It's going to be, even if I talk about the Jurchens, psychologically speaking, it mostly gets down to, okay, well, we talk about these guys today, but I'm not going to remember them because there aren't so many connections we made with other groups. Actually, like, speaking of the Khitan, speaking about the Kingidzes, etc., we did do Korea as well. We talked about these guys. So it's not like really the first time. These probably are less viewed videos in general because, again, I haven't made too much. I've made a fair amount of stuff on medieval Asia, all right? But mostly we talked about Western Asia at most. And yes, there's a lot of stuff about the Mongols, but not quite in connection with here 112 videos about medieval Asia. So not necessarily in connection with the other policies per se, not the relation with the West, etc. So there is always actually a lot to do. This is not merely, let's say, some random content that I make every once in a while to sort of appease the followers. For example, here I see Ancient Asian Warfare. It was a recent playlist that got several tens of views immediately. So it really depends also on what people are searching for that matter, and how the stuff gets probably, again, showed in the YouTube algorithm, etc. That is really very important. But having a clearer picture of medieval Asian warfare, ancient Asian warfare as a whole, I think it's something that on Schwerpunkt we're carrying out for the first time on YouTube, and probably in this way like ever. Meaning that this focus, this attention, this schematism regarding, say, like we've done today for a relatively, you can't say minor people, again, because the Jin dynasty is important. The Jurchens have an interesting history, etc. But something that is not as big for the kids at Yuan's, maybe shorter, maybe also less known, but say a sort of broader ethno-geographic background, how they developed politically, militarily, and how they were influenced. They influenced other by and how they influence other peoples fundamentally. Military culture, I think, is really important. I think it can't simply be, let's say, put aside. It's something you must know. Some people do not even have a clear picture of, I don't know, Eastern Europe. So you may wonder, how can they even care about medieval Asia? Well, that's the point. Like, the more you end up talking about topics that are also relatively not known, and paradoxically, maybe since not many people talk about them, you can more easily get there first and getting more attention in the same process. So really, I think that is an option, and what we're doing here is largely, beneficial to the broader sort of overview of these military cultures. It surely requires time, right? We do this, as I was saying before, I don't do it really because I think it's a novelty or anything. This is really a random sort of special topic that I pick for the occasion. This is part of a structured series that deals exactly with, in fact, completing the entire ancient and medieval Asian warfare, right? It can be cursory, and then we get into some greater depths of it. I don't know what kind of other future, more in-depth series I can create for the future, but surely the intent is there, right? It's not really some wishful thinking. As far as the channel goes, it goes. I mean, we could get more views, especially in the last couple of weeks. Didn't make so many. I don't understand why. Sometimes these topics do bring the average down, but it's not really that. Sometimes you have these topics, you say, oh my god, nobody's going to watch that, but these goes really a great amount of view. Maybe the thumbnail sometimes, but no, not really. So that I can't simply foresee that. And this is also the beauty of the channel. It has ups and downs, but continues growing, and nothing has ever stopped it. So here we continue. This is it, and I'd say that it's rewarding enough, right? Because this is the secret of it. Reading the comments here, I discover very interesting things. There are people who listen to me while they are at work, in the office, or in the truck, or wherever. That's also quite interesting to see how the word spreads, literally. And again, it's mostly from my side a matter of habit. For example, recently I had yet another sort of weird cough. I don't know why. I had COVID last month. So sometimes the videos can be more or less boring. My voice can be, paradoxically, I think I'm more orderly when I'm speaking like a bit undertone like this, because I take a bit more of time. I'm more careful. I don't put a lot of, breath in this, and so I also don't become too wild in expression. But it's really helping me understanding what people really want. I notice, for example, the question and answer video often revolves around, for example, this more extra topic. People are interested in things like I published yesterday, that video talking about China, talking about exactly these very people. So you see how, also from the cycle that is partly random, how these topics recur, right? How the glue that I was talking about before always comes about, right? It's not really anecdotal or rhetorical. People are interested in learning history, and I don't know how good I am as a teacher, because honestly I detest teaching. Like, as a historian, the best thing I love really doing, that excites me, is researching, right? But then, of course, in part, as a historian, you must be out there telling what you found out. And in this way, also being able to develop a narrative, to be more understood, etc. And YouTube is strange because it follows its own rules to an extent, but it's also, in the sense, very didactic, I think, because it makes you see how you can't really give for granted the efforts that you make, right? You can't give for granted the attention of the audience. You have to be always able to renovate yourself, to improve, etc. I don't know how relevant or let's say competitive this content can be at some point, right? For example, last autumn we made really so many views. Like, we made easily double what we did now in the last month, for example. And it was the same type of videos. Actually, the ones I make today are even slightly better for many reasons. But YouTube, for some reason, would not launch them into hyperspace like it happened just some month ago. So it's sort of strange. And that's something that, although I can't really control, I don't know enough to predict, right? So more than making the more or less the same kind of content, or at least I also made always new content every once in a while, but still sticking to a base that is the same. Plus experimenting other avenues, etc. I don't know how to handle this really, and generally I think that we are on the right track. We have ever more members, for example. We have ever more subscribers. There's always somebody subscribing newly. There is always somebody sharing, etc. So it may be, I don't know, different times of the year, whether people are more or less at home. For example, I think that's a pretty obvious factor to a degree. I always notice that September and October are very much like, especially September, like it always gets so many different views, like where you get this sort of viral wave and vibe, etc. So it's always unclear to an extent, however, how much you can replicate that later. Normally what happens there is that there is a plateau. You get sort of more views, and then there's basically for a while a time in which you get more views and more subscribers, and that toughens the plateau that slightly rises, right? But other times it's sort of way more complicated. Also, looking at the people that subscribe, for example, you're really a varied population. Let's put it in this way, like you can understand maybe why certain figures are more or less interested in the work that you do, why more, but again, also the level of interaction. Like, you wonder, how is it possible to have, for example, almost 27,000 subscribers, but having these ups and downs? Like, it's difficult to imagine that the algorithm is so powerful to simply dictate, or at least to orient the trends, the choices of so many different people. And so that's why, actually, when you stop counting subscribers like just as a number, and you start looking at the profiles every once in a while, you realize that there is such great potential in people. And if we really wanted to bring this channel to the start, so to say, we could do it overnight. Really. And so it's always a step away. You may subscribe to Schwerpunkt for sort of different reasons, in as much as, of course, it would be difficult to unsee it in this regard. At the same time, there is surely a difficulty again in simply directing this. Like, it's subscriptions may not mean too much too many times, right? But they are surely connected with the way probably people feel that this sort of the YouTube sort of tells them to do or not to do to some extent, right? So it's somehow difficult to see through it. It's really complicated. Sometimes it's just the videos. I realize that there are some topics that, like this one, for example. This one may be interesting, as I said before, just because who does ever make a video about it? I will check that. I'm sure that it's possible that there are more videos about these topics than sort of more conventional ones in European history. Because who are the Jurchen? Let me see. Yeah, there is actually pretty like a couple of videos. They're years old, right? And there is some interesting stuff here, even about the heavy cavalry they used and some topics we touch upon. So it's not so strange. You see, there is enough about the Jurchens, but it makes you feel considered, again, probably the disproportionate attention towards this topic here on YouTube, as I prognosticated before searching right now, that given the relative level of superficiality to which the same Western warfare of the same era is treated, that the reason why the Jurchens are pointed out is just like they were there, they're sort of exotic, and for this sense they get also magnified here. Look at how much was the Jurchen legacy, like in titles like this, right? My point is instead completely different. My point is to analyze the topic like this, staying fairly objective about the sort of the broader implications. Like, for example, it may sound as if I were I don't know, not really belittling. I think it's evident that I'm not doing that. But let's say you see here the Jurchen stay around for a century, and it's even, again, something I praised before. But why? Because, we're talking about places in times, so peoples mostly in this frontier that do not inspire this great deal of stability. In Europe, you really have to get as far east as the steppes to realize that there weren't probably powers that were so stable equally. And Western Eurasia was actually more, say, the Western Eurasian steppes were more florid, as you know, than the northeastern one, the northeastern Eurasian one. So it's interesting to see what different tempo, with different survival rate, let's say, this dynasty's had, right? We are habituated, even when you look at, I don't know, at the Avars or the Bulgars, to have something actually more stable. Even in the more east, you go think about the Volga Bulgars or other people. Like, there is a bulk, some basis that sort of survives even beyond. Probably when you look at China, it was something relatively similar, but definitely not politically so stable, so recognizable. I think the problem is that we don't study, or at least there's less to know, and in that sense it's probably true that in the absence of further ethno-anthropological evidence of some sort, we tend to flatten the picture. But it's possible really that, as I explained also in some kind of comparison with other peoples, with other cultures, that yes, these, especially the Chinese people, were sort of more subservient to power. It was easier to establish some broader domain over these people. It would, again, also be powerful on their own. It's not to say that being subservient was not to be powerful, but they were more wired to accept this kind of political change at the top rather than informing it itself, like taking over the control. So again, these are deep millenary differences across Eurasia that, as I explained also in some videos about the Han military compared, say, to the Roman one, I think they're increasingly more evident to an extent. China got sort of more morally exhausted over time in ways that Europe didn't for some reason. And so even the notion of political unity, it's something very debatable in terms of the actual amount of forces that agitated themselves in a constructive way within, for example, Europe as opposed to other places. So it's, again, very, very difficult indeed. But again, like, this is also history, and that's also why I make these videos, because it's just interesting to assess the objectivity of something. That's why I make videos. I wouldn't have any other reason. And sometimes I feel I even overestimate certain systems because they're not European, and knowing less, like, I sort of give for granted more, like, for them to be functioning sort of more spirited ways, but they wouldn't. And so I end up eventually becoming more pessimistic about that and sounding perhaps biased, some say, or Western-centric or whatever. Not really. Otherwise, I wouldn't even make these videos. Instead, I find them very interesting exactly because I'm interested in the actual rest of the evidence in general. So this is some insight in the work, right, and how this is why I do this, etc. So again, this is fairly important. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.